time was 221 BC. Historical forces, unleashed by the disintegration of an old social and political order, were now harnessed by the state of Qin to annex 6 other powers. China, reunified, entered the Imperial Age. The king of Qin, who narrowly escaped assassination, now proclaimed himself the first emperor of a perpetual dynasty. His domain was to reach the 4 extremes, east to the sea, west to the desert, south to Vietnam, and north to the Great Wall. The most massive man-made object on Earth, the Great Wall we see today, is largely the result of rebuilding and repair in the 16th century. Originally, the first emperor linked parts of walls built by northern states in the 4th century BC into a continuous boundary line separating 2 worlds, the nomadic one, which spanned northern and central Asia, and the agricultural one, which centered in China. It extended more than 5,000 kilometers to embrace and protect new territories wrested from the Xiongnu, a Mongoloid people who herded sheep and cattle and fought on horseback. Within China, Minister Li Zi imposed uniformity on every facet of daily life. The script was simplified into one style. Currency, weights, measures, and the axle width of chariots were standardized. To concentrate power at the top, the emperor divided the country into provinces and appointed the highest provincial officials directly from the court. Never before was an administrative system in China so tightly organized. Newly built roads reached all the important parts of the empire, and the emperor personally inspected his domain several times, marking summits of famous mountains near the eastern sea with engraved stone steles. To eliminate local influences and stabilize new areas, the emperor shifted 120,000 scattered rich and powerful families to the capital and transferred large populations to borderlands. He leveled fortifications between former feudal states and melted down their weapons. At that time, his central army was the only armed force in the largest empire of the world. To silence old-time scholars who cited the past to criticize the present, the emperor decreed that all books except those related to Qin history and practical arts such as agriculture and medicine be burned, and all who discussed ancient literature and histories be executed. Angered by the escape of 2 magicians who failed to fulfill their promise of delivering the elixir of life, the emperor deemed many scholar magicians of them buried alive. The great unifier died. Only lifeless statues watch over his mountainous tomb, for his absolute power now fell into the hands of a scheming eunuch who manipulated the young second emperor. Far from the palace, 900 farmer draftees on their way to northern borders were delayed by heavy rain. Not arriving on time meant the death penalty. 2 among them convinced the others to turn their farm implements into weapons, signaling the first peasant rebellion in Chinese history. They met early defeat, but the revolution spread. With the murder of the second emperor in 207 BC, the Qin dynasty ended, having lasted only 14 years. China once again plunged into chaos. A rebel leader named Liu Bang won over all other contenders in 202 BC. His reunited empire, now called Han, was to achieve greater glory on the foundation built by Qin. The war-torn country needed peace, and the early Han court favored the Taoist principle of non-action by simplifying laws, cutting taxes, and returning the farmer-soldier to the land. Gradually, the scorched earth turned green, the weary gained strength, and the population multiplied. But a constant threat hung over the northern frontiers. The founding of Han coincided with the rise of the Xiongnu, whose cavalry almost captured the first Han emperor. Han bought peace by marrying a princess to the enemy chieftain and sending heavy gifts of silk, wine, and grain. Even so, from Manchuria in the east to Lake Balkhash in the west, the nomadic empire pressed hard on its southern neighbor, staging raids at will. In the year 140 BC, the newly enthroned Emperor Wu shifted from a defensive policy to an offensive one. He made extensive preparations that included the breeding of horses all over the country. He made plans to sever the enemy's two wings by cutting his liaison with eastern and western vassals and destroying his major forces in the center. To carry out this grand strategy, China's destiny became entwined with that of the western region. In 138 BC, Emperor Wu sent his envoy, Chang Qian, to seek an alliance with Yue Ju, a victim of the Xiongnu. Chang was caught by the enemy and spent 10 years in captivity. He escaped and reached his destination only to find Yue Ju unwilling to join the fight. But the report of his 13-year journey, the earliest eyewitness account of Central Asia in world history, gave Emperor Wu the knowledge to act. First, the Han army occupied the western corridor, through which Chang Qian was sent to contact the Wusun, Han's best potential ally. Advocating diplomacy, Chang Qian began his second mission in 119 BC by bringing large numbers of cattle and sheep and quantities of gold and silk. 4 years later, he returned with envoys and gift horses from Wusun, as well as a firm alliance. Zhang's lieutenants fanned out to many countries as far as Parthia and India. They too returned with envoys of goodwill. The West had been opened. Tranquility came to the Ordos, an area embraced by the northern bend of the Yellow River, as Han forced the Xiongnu to retreat deep into Mongolia. Now Emperor Wu expanded southward to Vietnam and eastward to Korea. In 108 BC, the peninsula was colonized after a campaign by land and sea. Through this outpost, Chinese culture seeped into Japan, whose chief received a golden seal as a king under Han. But the West had not been won. In 101 BC, Fergana killed the Han envoy instead of complying with his request for fine horses. The retaliatory expedition, which traveled across the Tarim Basin and over the Pamirs, scored total victory after 40 days of siege. The prize was famed Fergana horses, now adding mobility and strength to the Han striking force. In a decisive battle in 60 BC, the Xiongnu surrendered to the first Chinese garrison commander in the western region. By 36 BC, Han influence covered Kashmir, Kazakhstan, Sirdarya Valley, Ili Valley, the area around the Pamirs, in addition to the Xinjiang province of today. Some 50 countries received titles and ranks from the Han court, just 1 century after Chang Qian's first step toward the west. In this period of expansion, Deng Qiungshu championed a new brand of Confucianism. He proclaimed the oneness of heaven and man. When human events are in harmony with heaven, peace prevails. When they are contrary to heaven, upheavals occur. Heaven always supports the benevolent ruler and removes the tyrant. This was why Qin fell and Han rose. It was no wonder that Emperor Wu honored Deng's Confucianism above all other schools of philosophy. After a brief interruption by a usurper in 9 AD, the founder of the later Han moved the capital eastward to Luoyang, thus giving it also the name Eastern Han. To pacify peasant rebels and revive the war-shattered economy were the first order of the day. With domestic affairs claiming its full effort, the new Han court watched over the border areas for invaders, but refrained from taking expensive military action. Renewed Xiongnu pressure was not met by force until 73 AD. The explorer Ban Chao led 36 men to penetrate further west. His matchless courage and wit inspired loyalty among the foreigners, and for over 20 years he dominated the western region with only the troops of subjugated countries. He would have even contacted Rome if upon reaching the Persian Gulf his envoy had not been turned back by the Parthians' fantastic tales of peril. As common people and private merchants were allowed to enter the western region freely, trade and cultural exchanges prospered. A new Road of the Oasis gradually became the most important link between East and West. It was to be named the Silk Road in the 19th century. China was known to the Greeks as the land of silk. The rise of Rome almost coincided with the opening of the Silk Road, and silk adorned the person of Cleopatra. The craze for silk contributed in no small measure to the drain on the Roman treasury. Over this thoroughfare traveled other Chinese goods such as lacquer and technology such as steel making and underground channel building for irrigation. Equally important was the traffic eastward. Fergana horses, grapes, and alfalfa led the list, followed by walnuts, melons, pears, sesame, carrots, and onions. All of them became a part of Chinese daily life, as well as the lion, which was exotic but highly visible in Chinese art. Music and musical instruments, including the lute and the harp, enriched the part of Chinese culture that was deficient. Magicians and acrobats delighted the fun-loving Han people. Though Han China looked outward to the limits of its view and flexed its muscles to dominate the neighbors, its inner spirit was basically conservative and harked back to ancient mysticism. Widely believed was the 4th century BC cosmology, the yin and yang, or negative and positive dynamics, and the 5 elements of wood, fire, soil, metal, and water. Forces of nature were transformed into symbols, such as the 4 cardinal directions. East was identified with the blue dragon, wood, spring, and minor yang. South with the red phoenix, fire, summer, and major yang. West with the white tiger, metal, autumn, and minor yin. North with the black tortoise and snake, water, winter, and major yin. In the center was man, the super animal of all seasons, capable of harmonizing with yin and yang. His color was yellow, and his element the earth. But since man's livelihood was agriculture, his dependence on heaven's favor was almost total. Han royalty believed in the magic of jade for preserving their remains from decay. Thousands of jade plates strung together with threads of gold, silver, or copper formed the eternal burial suits, which eventually held only dust. But later Han also produced a few men of science. Wang Chung believed that heaven and earth were natural objects devoid of will, that the human body ended with death without leaving any spirit, that hallucinations were caused by sickness. For him, truth came only from concrete evidence. Chang Hung denied that earthquakes and windstorms were caused by the anger of heaven. His weather vane could forewarn the coming of wind, and his seismograph, reconstructed here by a Chinese scientist, probably contained an inverted pendulum reacting toward the center of disturbance, which released a ball from the dragon's mouth to that of a waiting frog, both situated in the direction of an earthquake. He theorized that heaven was like an egg with earth its yolk, and that it revolved around the earth. He discovered that the moon received light from the sun and rotated around the earth, and that the changing positions of sun, moon, and earth caused it to wax and wane, while the shadows of the earth caused its eclipse. The prototype of such an armillary sphere was created by Chong Hung, who made it rotate by water pressure, and he checked its accuracy by observing celestial phenomena. His sphere was preserved for nearly 300 years. Other major Han inventions and developments left lasting imprints on coming generations. A magnetic spoon simulating the shape of the Big Dipper always pointed south, foretelling the coming of the magnetic compass. In the beginning of the 2nd century, paper made of bark, hemp, rags, and fish nets came into being and gradually replaced costly silk and bulky bamboo and wooden slips as writing material. Han engineers developed the technique of deep well drilling for brine and natural gas, then used the gas to boil the brine into salt. The invention of a water-powered furnace air pump, which converted rotary motion into reciprocal motion, improved iron making. Doctors accumulated a vast body of knowledge on botany, for they relied on plants for medicine. Acupuncture, which had been invented earlier and gained widespread usage in this period, was mentioned in the biographies of famous doctors. These golden needles came from a Han tomb. But the House of Han eventually lost its vigor. Power struggles among royal relatives, scholar officials, and eunuchs raged around child emperors, perpetuating corruption and misrule that drove the hungry masses into open rebellion. The empire came to an end in 220 AD. During the 4 centuries of which the midpoint was the birth of Christ, China built its first empires of Qin and Han and extended its political and cultural influences from Japan to Central Asia, from Mongolia to Vietnam. China, the name of the country known to the Western world, comes from Qin. The name of the language and people known to the Chinese themselves is Han.